working? Okay. Thank you very much, Anya. Let's switch over here. Okay, today we're going to be talking about catching unicorns. Not really, obviously, but it seemed like a really fun title. How many people are familiar with XPlat by a show of hands? Excellent, you came to the talk. Well, the next one's going to be great too. So we're going to be learning about XPlat, and then we're also going to be learning a little bit about NX by Narwhal. How many people are familiar with NX workspaces? A couple more hands? Good, excellent. So hopefully this will be informative for people that haven't heard of either of those technologies. You can follow me on Twitter, Brian_Love, and I also blog at brianflove.com. I'm a Google developer expert in Angular and web technologies, and I'm also from New York, but I'm not exactly from this part of New York. So I grew up in upstate New York. You can see on the map, it's pretty far away from New York. Kind of a funny story, when I tell people in Denver that I'm from New York, they immediately go, "Oh, dude, I love New York." And I go, no, hold on. They're like, what? And I'm like, I'm not from that part of New York. And I have to tell them there's this entire state, part of the lower 48. Anyways, I'm also living in Denver, Colorado currently, and it's a picture of me and my wife skiing at a beautiful ski resort called Arapahoe Basin. So enough about me, though. Let's talk about Angular. So if you go to angular.io, one of the things that you're going to notice on the homepage is this kind of slogan, one framework, mobile, and desktop. And you may be familiar with using Angular primarily for web development, but we can use Angular to develop mobile and desktop applications as well. And one of the ways that we can do that is using a technology called XPlat. So XPlat is a cross-platform tool for NX. So XPlat really sits on top of NX. So let's quickly talk about what NX is. NX Workspaces revolves around tooling, right? So that kind of tooling that you get with NX Workspace are things like Jest for unit testing, Cypress for end-to-end testing, and all the other tooling that you're used to in the Angular ecosystem. NX is also full stack, so it allows you to develop full stack applications all in a single repository. So we can have our Angular application, and it can live alongside of a Node backend, and we can use Express or something like Nest if we'd like as well. NX is also holistic. Like I just mentioned, we can put all of our code in a single monorepo, and we can share code between our applications. And it's not just code co-location, because that's kind of one principle. This is really sharing code amongst multiple applications using libraries and, and exporting things out of your modules. So one of the things that people kind of say to me when I start talking about NX is they're like, oh, that's great. Is this a replacement for the CLI? And it is not. So NX Workspaces kind of sits on top of the CLI and extends it a little bit. So now you might be thinking, okay, all right, so I'm kind of getting an understanding of what NX is, but how does XPlat fit into all of this? And like I was saying, you can think about it this way. We've got the Angular CLI, and that's at the base. On top of that, we've got NX. NX extends the CLI using what's called schematics. And then further, XPlat further extends that CLI and NX, again, using schematics to enable you to do cross-platform development with Angular. So when we mean cross-platform, we're talking about things like the backend, like I already mentioned, on the server. So in this case, perhaps using Nest that sits on top of Express and runs on Node.js. On the desktop, we're talking about Electron. For mobile, you're going to be developing apps using either NativeScript or Ionic. And those apps are going to be deployed to the Google Play or to the App Store. So they're hybrid applications if you want to think about it like that. And then finally, we can create applications for the browser. So why did XPlat get created? Well, like a lot of things, there's this idea of complexity around building cross-platform applications. We also want to be able to share code amongst applications and amongst platforms. So that was a definite need there. The other thing was inconsistency. Some people were doing it one way, and maybe other projects, they kind of did it a little different way of organizing the code and the structure of the applications. And so by using schematics and using XPlat, we can enforce this consistency for our cross-platform development. So the solution was, hey, NX is great. let's just build on top of NX and extend it a little bit further. So we're going to provide that consistency through schematics by enforcing the structure and the architecture of our applications. And we want it to be scalable. We want to make it really easy to add additional platforms or remove platforms at ease in our mono repo. The last thing that I like, and I'll be showing this at the end, is XPlat provides a focused developer mode. So if you're a Nest or an Express or Node developer and you want to go into the repo and you don't really care about this Ionic app or this native script app and you just kind of want to make them disappear, you can use a schematic to do that. And it's going to modify the Visual Studio Code configuration for your settings, and it's basically just going to hide everything except what you need to work on, which would be the Node Express backend. So you can kind of think about the structure as this pyramid. So this is very similar to what you might do with just a traditional NX environment. The important part here is kind of that middle tier, right? And that's where we're going to have our cross-platform code. So at the base, we have our libs directory. That's where we're going to put all of our code that's going to be shared across platforms and across applications. The next layer, if you will, is the XPlat directory. And that's where we're going to have the code that is going to be specifically targeted for a specific platform. So you might have code that's for Ionic, or you might have code for Electron, and code for your Nest backend. On top of that, you're going to implement all of those modules and components, do all your routing as necessary for your applications in your actual apps directory. And in your apps directory, you can have multiple applications and multiple applications that target multiple platforms. So you could have a web platform that's for your consumer site. You could have a backend or an admin platform that's also web. You could have a native script application for deploying to Google Play and App Store, and kind of build things the way you need to. Cool. So hopefully at this point, I've kind of perked your ears a little bit, and you're like, oh, this is great, Brian. Let's see some more. How do we actually do this? So pretty standard, right? We need to install some stuff first. So you're going to need to have this Angular CLI installed, and then you're also going to need to install the narwhal schematics. And then once you do that, you're going to have this create NX workspace. So you're going to invoke that, and you're going to just give it the name of the workspace that you're going to create. So we're going to create a unicorn workspace. And then once you're inside of that workspace, you're going to use an NgAdd command, and you're going to add the NStudio schematics. And that's the XPlat schematics that you're going to be adding. You can optionally provide a prefix. That prefix will be stored in angular.json. That'll be the prefix that's going to be used for all of your applications. And then you can also tell it, hey, these are the platforms I want to develop for. So in this case, I want to develop for the web. I want to develop for native script, Ionic, and Nest. And it's going to go ahead and scaffold everything out for you. I would recommend the Angular console, also by the Narwhal folks. If you haven't used the console before, it's a great way to get started with a schematic, especially if you're not used to all the options and commands that you can apply. It's really nice. It's a nice GUI interface, basically on top of the CLI. You can use it in VS Code if you want, and then they also have like a standalone application for, I think they have Windows, Mac, and then an experimental version for Linux. Okay, so the kind of the steps that you're going to follow when building apps with XPlat is the first thing you're going to do is you're going to generate out an application. And we'll do that here in a second. Then you're going to generate a feature. And then on top of that feature, you're going to generate the necessary components for a feature. And then you're going to import that feature and the necessary components into an application by platform. Here's a couple examples of generating commands. So you just use NgGenerate, and I've used the G, which is short for the generate. So if you're used to typing the full command in the CLI, so you can kind of fill in, instead of G, it's generate. And then we can just NgGapp. And by default, it's going to generate out a web application. But if we want to generate out other platform applications, we can do so. So we can do NgGapp.NativeScript, app.Ionic, app.Electron, and app.Nest. You give them all an app name. The only one that's a little bit different is the electronic. You have to tell it which web app you're going to kind of target, and that's an additional parameter you have to put in there. So let's do a demo. Let me switch over to VS Code, and I bet I got to bump this a bit. All right. So I'm going to use the console. And what I've already done here, just going to make sure that we have it set up and ready to go. All I've run at this point is that create NX workspace. And then after that, I added the schematic, right? So I haven't done anything other than those first two steps, just so we don't have to sit here and watch like an NPM install. So if we scroll down, the first thing we're going to see is we see this NStudio schematic. And now I have a couple of options in terms of what I want to generate out. So we can generate out a app. And we'll give it a name. I'm going to just call this the admin app. And you can see here that the files that are going to be generated, can I change the width of this? I guess not, huh? So the command is going to be NgGenerate app. It's going to create this admin interface. And you're going to notice that it prefixes all of your applications in the apps directory with the platform. So in this case, it's apps/web/whatever, or dash, whatever the name is of your project. So we can go ahead and generate that out. You can also run this on the command line, obviously, if you're more familiar with that kind of interface. And we don't need to watch the npm install. Suppose I should have skipped it. Cool. And so then let's take a look at the kind of the files here. Get rid of this outline, huh? So the first thing you're going to notice is underneath apps, here's my web app, right, that I generated. This is a standard Angular application that got dropped in here for us. But the more important part is to kind of look at this explat directory. So that's that middle tier that we talked about. This is where you're going to put the code that is specific to a platform, not necessarily specific to an application, but specific to a platform. So in this case, you're targeting the web, right? So you're going to use web templates, right? You're going to use a div tag, whereas if you're an Ionic, you might do like ion-list or whatever it is for your templates. So you can see now here inside of web core, we get an app, there's a base component. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But you see here inside of features and UI in our components, oh, we didn't do a feature yet, sorry. So that's our explat, and then if we look inside libs, we also have this additional kind of base tier as well. And did we want to generate out another app? Let's do a native script app. I'm going to switch over to the command line. Bump this up. We'll call this Unicorn. So this is going to create all the necessary things that we need for a native script application. Kind of full screen this. So you will see some of the configurations for Xcode and all of that. And then we'll also see that it updates our package JSON and everything that we need. All right, good. So we've got a couple apps generated out. Boom, done, go home, right? So we generate out some apps, we're good to go, but then our boss shows up and he's like, yeah, well that's great and all, Brian, but I actually need you to like build some features for these applications. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it's like to build a feature. The first thing we want to do is we want to target, again, multiple projects. We want to be able to target multiple platforms inside of our mono repo. We want to share code across all of our platforms, and we also want to share code across our applications for every platform. To generate out a feature, it kind of looks like this. The first thing that we're going to generate out is in the libs directory, we're going to have a features directory that you saw earlier. And inside there's going to be the name of the feature. And then you're going to have a module. So if we do an admin feature, let's say, you're also going to have an admin module that's going to get generated. The next kind of layer up is that explat directory. Inside here, you're going to generate out that admin module, that feature, for every platform that you're targeting. So if you're targeting multiple platforms, it's going to generate all of those out for you. And then finally, inside that explat, inside the for each platform, for the feature that you're generating, it's going to stub out a component for you. You can ignore this as well. There's an option that says like skip the stubbed component or whatever. So if you don't want this last component to be kind of created for you, you can skip that. If you're like routing to a generic like index page or something, maybe that's kind of nice to have. So this is what this one looks like. So if we look here, we're just going to do NgGenerate. And then instead of like generate on a component or something that you're used to doing with a CLI, now you're going to be generating out a feature. So we're going to do NgGenerate feature, give it the name of the feature, and then tell it what platforms we're targeting for that feature. So in this case, I'm going to be targeting the web and native script. And this is kind of what we get as a result of that. So we'll get inside of our XPlat directory, underneath the web directory, we're going to have an admin component. And then we're also going to have an admin component inside of NativeScript because we told it to target both of those platforms. And both of those components are going to extend a root-based component that's an abstract class that takes care of some of the unsubscribing from RxJS observables for us. To implement a feature, it's pretty easy. Now that we've created it, we're going to just bring that into whatever application we want. So we go inside our apps directory, and then wherever we need that feature, let's just go ahead and bring in that module as necessary. In this case, you're just going to substitute out the workspace with whatever the name is of the workspace that you created when you executed create NX workspace. So in this case, we called it unicorn, so this would be @unicorn/web or @unicorn/nativescript. So let's take a look at generating out a feature. I'm going to grab the code from up above. We'll just make an admin feature. Okay, so you can see here that it created inside libs, created our feature, our admin module. We also, inside the web and NativeScript platforms that we're targeting, we got those components and those modules that I was talking about. And so now we're ready to start building on top of this feature. So when building out a feature, you're going to get an abstract class like I talked about that's a component for all of your platforms. And you can put some logic in there if you need to, or you can have some properties that you can access. And then you can have concrete components for each platform, again, that you're targeting. And then the last thing I like about XPlat is they use barrel files. So if you're not familiar with this, it's basically an index.ts that exports everything inside of the modules inside of it. So that'll make it really easy when you go to import things. Because as you saw, the folder structure gets pretty deep when you're using XPlat. And because they use these barrel files, your imports are not like super, super long. It's just @workspace/web or whatever it is. So if we look at an example of this, here we're going to generate out a component for our feature. So we're going to generate out the user list. We're going to tell it what feature to generate this component inside of. And then we're also going to tell it what platforms we intend to use this feature for. I'm also using the create base flag. That's used to give it an abstract base class that all platforms will extend. So if you want that kind of functionality where you're going to put some stuff in there, you can do that. That's optional. If you don't do that, you will not get the user list base component that you see here on the first line. So here's an example of kind of what that looks like. Again, we're targeting web and NativeScript, so we'll get a user list component for both of those, and then we'll implement those components as necessary for those platforms. And then those will extend an abstract user list base component. We can put some stuff in there if we want to. That's kind of cross-platform code. And then that one in turn extends the root base component that all of our components extend. Again, that would be cross-platform as well. You can skip that kind of middle tier if you want with that create base flag. And if you just omit that, then you won't get that. Okay, cool. You can also generate directives, pipes, services, and NgRx code as well using XPlat. So it's really kind of full-featured in terms of developing for multi-platform. Again, you're just going to use those same flags, the platform equals, and then a comma-separated list. So you might be thinking at this point, well, you know, we don't really do cross-platform development. I mean, this is kind of neat and everything, but I'm not sure if I really need this. So I came up with a really simple diagram for you. Is basically, if you start a project and you don't need multi-platform, then just go ahead and you can keep starting projects. Of course, it becomes kind of tedious, but I think what you'll find is over time is you may want to actually consider using XPlat when you're starting a project today, because you may end up doing cross-platform development in the future, and then you don't have to worry about kind of bringing everything into a monorepo and adjusting it and kind of, you know, lifting it yourself. So you could get started if you're doing a new project today that's not going to be cross-platform immediately. You can certainly get started with XPlat and just target web or just target NativeScript or Ionic if that's what you need to do. it's certainly a great tool. The last thing I wanted to show you guys is the developer modes that I talked about. This feature is VS Code only. So everything else that I've showed you so far, if you're using WebStorm or IntelliJ or whatever it is, you can certainly do all of that using the Angular console or using the CLI. But with VS Code, we can use what's called developer modes. So these developer modes provide us a focused view into our code. So if I'm just working on the native script, I've got a user story that just came in, or I've got to fix a bug, and I know it's just in our native script platform, I can just get rid of everything else in VS Code and just focus on the native script stuff. And like I mentioned, this is VS Code only. So you actually use the generate command, which is a little odd, but that's what they use in order to modify your VS Code user settings. So if you run ngg mode and then you give it either web or whatever kind of platform you want to focus in on, you run that command and it'll modify your VS Code settings so that way you're just seeing the code that you want to see. The default obviously is full stack. Basically full stack is show me everything in the mono repo, right? We can take a look at that here. So let me switch over here. And if we go underneath XPlat, did it not refresh? I thought I created a, didn't I do a native script app? Here's my web app. Huh. Where'd my native script go? Well, we can just focus on web, I guess. So let's do ngg mode, and we'll do web. I can just kind of show you what that does. Now, obviously, I'm only going to see all the web stuff. I guess you kind of have to believe me that it would hide all the native script stuff. If we go into my preferences and go to settings, and then get rid of that sidebar, and then come in here, we can see here that it's going to toggle all of the settings in this files exclude, right? And so you can see in files exclude, the web stuff is not excluded, but native script, Ionic, Electron, and Nest are excluded, right? And if I switch this back to full stack, it'll kind of toggle those out, so that way I can just focus in on the code that I need to when I'm working on it. So I find that really helpful, especially when you got a huge mono repo with a lot of different apps. All right. The last thing that I want to mention is they also have a really good consistent script structure. So when you're using lots of different, you got a back end you got to start up, maybe you got a front end, and you're kind of all over the place on a particular day perhaps, they make it really consistent for you in order to start and to clean and to build. So they have a good naming pattern. So if you want to start up an application, it's just npm run start dot whatever the platform is, so dot web, and then whatever dot app name is. So if you want to start up your admin website, you would just do npm run start web admin. If you want to start up something that has a specific target, like NativeScript or Ionic, you just append the target on top of that. So you would do .iOS or .android. There's a couple things I wanted to mention real quick with XPlat and Ionic. We did a project a few months ago with XPlat and Ionic and kind of stumbled a little bit, and so I thought I would share some of the tips that we learned as part of that process. So when you get started with XPlat and Ionic, they're going to use the latest version of Ionic, which is great, the released version 4 that just came out this year. But keep in mind that v4 by default uses what's called capacitor. So for those of you that are Ionic developers, you're going to kind of go, oh, yeah. If you want to use the Cordova plugins and not the capacitor plugins, you can do that, but there's a little bit of work you got to do in order to make that happen, but it is possible. Another key thing that you want to do is you want to create some scripts around swapping out your config XMLs per platform, because otherwise you kind of run into some issues with that. And then also make sure that you separate out your package JSON for dependencies. And you also want to specify exact versions of dependencies. So we ran into some really funky issues where the root package JSON had this dependency version, and you use like a caret or a tilde, and somebody npm'd installed in there, and then it didn't update in the Ionic, and then you get all this kind of like very strange error messages. So you're going to want to lock down those to be exact versions. And then finally, you can also have, there's an additional prepare script for NPM for Ionic. So those of you that are doing Ionic development, you're going to recognize that. Say, yep, there you go. That's where we get a prepare up, whether we're doing iOS or Android. All right, thank you very much. And that's how you catch a unicorn with XPlat. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brian. Let's make 10 minutes break, right? And submit your application for raffle. Can we?
Yeah. You want to go back to this one?
Thank you. It's here.
And is it doing it up there? No, just on my monitor. All right. I think we're ready to go here. All right, one, I'm sick, so don't shake my hand. Say hi, but catching a little bit of a cold, so if you see me drinking water and grabbing candy out of my deal here, there are some Hall's cough drops coming down with something. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jesse Sanders. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Breebug. We're located in Denver, Colorado. I am also an Angular Google developer expert with Angular as well as web technologies. And I have the benefit of being able to travel all over the world and speaking about Angular and really cool topics. So actually I just got back from Tel Aviv, speaking over at Angular Up, and had a couple of days in Paris and a few days in Barcelona, and just got back from Barcelona last night. So poor me, it was a horrible, very tough trip. No, it was probably the best trip of my life. It was just absolutely phenomenal, really enjoyed it, a lot of fun, and so many great people. So with that, we're going to talk about NgRx tonight. Who's using NgRx right now? Awesome, that's more than typical. So typically I see more like about 40% of the crowd. That's a little over half here, so that's awesome. So I don't know if you knew this, but NgRx just had a birthday recently. NgRx is now 3.5 years old, okay? And what I thought was super interesting about this is that there's over 800,000 downloads that are occurring every month for NgRx. Okay, so this is a platform that's very mature in terms of there's not a lot of huge changes going on to the core pieces of it, though there have been some new features with version 8 that just came out. But overall, what we're considering in NgRx is very, very solid, and we're seeing the community really latch onto it, so that's fantastic. So the one thing I can tell you right out of the gate, people ask me about NgRx, and I do talks all over the world about it, and something I'm very passionate about using it in projects is actually, if you're thinking about using NgRx, slow down. Start simple. It might not be the best option for you. And what I mean by this is that we often see people jump into NgRx thinking, wow, this is going to really make my project great. This is going to be a fantastic way to do things, where people don't always understand what the implications are, or they're actually creating more complexity in their applications than what they actually need to have. Like the application itself is fairly simple, and so they don't need to actually bring in something like NgRx to kick the project off. So I'll actually recommend to people, slow down. Take a look at some other options before you start to roll out NgRx. There might be some other ways that you could get the state management that you want without having to pay that price right up front. Because the reality is that most projects don't need NgRx. They're not overly complicated, and that we can implement them in some other ways that would help our teams increase their velocity and get the project done sooner. But the one thing I want you to consider is that if you're going to do this is that you need a path. You need a path to a clear upgrade so that if you decide that you've got some complexity in your application, you can upgrade it. So who's actually built an application, decided on an architecture, built an application, and then realized towards the middle to the end of it that they've coded themselves into a corner and they're going to have to do massive rewrites to fix it, right? We've all been there. And those, who's not going to raise their hand no matter what I say? Where are those people at? He's back there? Okay, I see him. Thanks for pointing him out. So you want a clear path on how to do the upgrade so that you're not painting yourself in a corner, and you can take advantage of a tool like NgRx when it's appropriate. Okay, the number one thing I see with people when they're using NgRx, and really this is more of an RxJS problem, is they are subscribing. to everything. Okay, so the first tip I'll give you is stop subscribing. This is probably one of the worst things that you can do. You don't need to do it in most cases. And even worse, if this looks like your code, who's seen this, where I have a subscribe, success, returns a new observable, inside of that I'm subscribing, so on and so forth, where we have this nested chain and ball of hair and yarn that we have to unwind later. How would you test this? Okay, anybody, I mean, like testing NgRx and testing in general is difficult enough, let alone if you're writing code like this. This is very difficult. So stop doing that. Start looking at some other ways of doing things. One of those ways is container presenter, or smart components, dumb components. Who's doing container presenter now? Show of hands. Okay, so look around the room. That's a much smaller group. So if you're going to use tools like NgRx, you really need to start with learning how to build components properly and using the container presenter model. This is actually part of your upgrade path, and this is going to make your life a lot simpler. So instead of having to do this kind of crazy subscription sort of garbage going on, we can actually handle that using container presenter. So containers, let's talk about those really quick. Containers are really the brains of the operation. They're there to interact with the store. They're the ones that are making the decisions, doing things. In most applications, these are going to be your top level feature pages, and they're the ones that are going to be making all the decisions about what happens in our page here. So they're going to pass observable data via an async pipe. So this is how we get away from subscribing to stuff. We no longer need to subscribe. We can go ahead and use the async pipe, which, by the way, I mean, has anybody looked at the code for async pipe to see what's going on? We got a couple out here, okay? So it actually does do a subscribe, but it automatically then does the unsubscribe and destroys that so that you're not ending up in a memory leak and facing those sorts of issues. So it's going to pass an observable down. It's also going to then receive events from child components. So the child components are no longer going to be making decisions about how to handle things. That's going to get deferred back up to the parent, and the parent's going to get to make that choice. And like I say, they get to decide what to do with the event or the data that comes back up. So let's take a look at an example here. This is a really simple example. This is a dashboard component. And you can see the first thing here is we have a hero $ variable, and it's of type observable that has a type of hero array. So pretty simple. Our constructor, we're getting the hero service, we're getting the router, and on a init, we are setting our hero $ equal to the hero service get top heroes. So now this dot heroes, when it returns, when we get a value back from our service, which in this case is probably going to call an API and return some data back to us as an observable stream, I'm just going to hold it as an observable stream. I don't need to subscribe to it and unwrap it or do anything with it. And then that's going to get passed down to the child component. The function here on hero clicked, this is where we're actually going to handle an event from a child component. When the child component receives a click event, whether this be a user event or a system event, it's going to go ahead and take that and emit it back up. And the parent container is going to make the decision on what we're going to do with it. So pretty simple. What does this code look like from the HTML side? Very, very simple. We're going to go ahead within our container. We're going to create our child component. We're going to pass it the heroes using the square bracket notation of heroes. And we're going to pass it the heroes $. That's our observable stream using the async pipe, as I've already mentioned. Then we have the hero clicked. That is the event that's coming back up out of our child component. And we're going to map that to call the on hero clicked, passing it the event data to it, and making things really nice and clean, very simple. So let's talk about the other side of it. So presenters. Presenters are there to display data and make things pretty. They don't make decisions. They don't understand things about observables or where data comes from. They just kind of receive data and they're like, oh, cool, let me make this pretty. Let me handle this for you. They have no knowledge of stores or services. They're not dispatching events. They're not calling services. There are a couple of exceptions to this. If you have a service that is a utility function that's being shared by multiple components, that might be one more rare sort of exception. But if that service is then making calls to HTTP client or to the store to go get data, you've got a flaw in your implementation. And events, as I said, they are raised to the parent via event emitters. So the event emitter is going to allow us to go ahead and raise up when a user goes and clicks on a product. Instead of the presenter having to have a whole bunch of code in it that says, hey, if they clicked on this, then go ahead and route them over here or whatnot, it's just going to go ahead and emit that back out. So you might ask yourself, well, why would I do this? Well, let's talk about a little story that happens quite often. I go ahead and create a component. It's a product component, right? And I code it up for the way that I want it to work, and it works fantastic. And the guy over there that doesn't raise his hand, so he gets to copy my component. He's like, hey, this is perfect for me. But I don't want it to actually go to the edit page. I want it to go to this other review page first. Oh, okay, so he goes in and he passes in usually like a session service, right? Something where we're holding on to some variables. Usually starts out pretty innocent, only like we're going to store the J token or JWT token and some roles and permissions before we know it's like 600 lines of this absolute mess, right? And a little header at the top says, please don't touch without contacting Jesse Sanders first, or you will break all of production. Who's never done that, right? Yeah, right. I see you laughing. So he adds that service in and then starts to do some comparisons and says, well, hey, if this variable is set, then go do it Jesse's way. Otherwise, if this variable is set, let me go do it my way. And then you get a copy of the component. You add to the if then. You get a copy of it. Before we know it, this thing's like this huge tangled mess. So Brian comes along. He's a smart developer. And he's like, hey, this is a perfect component for me. I'm going to make a copy of it. And then I'm going to rip out all this junk you guys have been doing because I don't need any of this craziness and I don't want to be a part of this party. So now we have multiple copies of the same exact components and they have just slightly different variations on how they're functioning. That's why we get away from this. And that's what the container presenter model helps us with, is that now we can defer that back up to the parent and the parent can decide what we're going to do. The one challenge and probably the biggest question I get from people on this is, yeah, but what if it's like 5 levels deep? Do I have to pass an event, emit those events all the way back up? And the answer is no. You can actually, this is one of those exception pieces that you may have a service that, because an event emitter is nothing more than what? It's an observable stream. And so we could actually add this to a service and be able to emit it back up the chain that way, and that might be a simpler solution for us without having to have it nested so much. Great. So what does a presenter look like? You can see all the very complicated logic going on here, right? Yeah, there's no complicated logic. We have an input. We're receiving hero data, not as an observable. He doesn't have to know about how to deal, with unwrapping and subscribing to the data. I'm just going to receive hero data as a hero array. Great. And then I know that I'm going to need to output and let people know that if a hero was clicked, I want to go ahead and emit that up so whoever's listening can do whatever they decide to do with it. Again, I'm just here to make things pretty. I'm not actually doing anything, making any decisions. I'll go ahead and defer that to you. And here you see I've got my function called hero click. And when that happens, then I'm going to go ahead and emit the event up. Fantastic. So our component here is very lightweight. So how hard would this be to test? Like, this is the simplest code in the world to test. It's very lightweight. You're not going to be spending a lot of time. Now, I mean, you could go back to that nested subscribe, right? That's a really good one to test. That's like a 5th level ninja sort of unit testing. That's really tough stuff to do, where this is very, very simple. Great. So let's talk about one of the concepts that I would like you to look at before you consider using NgRx. And this is kind of your gateway service here on how you could implement something and that would give you some state management, but you wouldn't have to pay the price of implementing NgRx right out of the box. And this is called service with a subject. Anybody familiar with service with a subject? Okay, not. So again, we had almost half the room, or maybe even more than half the room, raising their hands for NgRx. This is I think one of the top things that you should really learn and understand is service with a subject. Because this is a really easy way to get you some state management without having to pay the price. And especially when you're dealing with CRUD operations or really simple operations in your application, service with a subject is exactly what you need. And then you can implement the NgRx pieces in the areas that it's really, really complicated. All right, so service with a subject is really nothing more than a plain old service with a behavior subject. So I've got an example here of a user service. Does anybody know why we'd use a behavior subject versus a subject? All right. As a value initially, yep. So I can give it a default value. What's the other reason that it's better to use? We can get what now? Synchronous value? Okay, I'm not sure I can totally hear you on that, but I'll give. I think you're saying the same thing that I'm thinking here. Okay. Yeah. The big reason here, and again, what you guys are saying there is that even if I show up to the party late, the party's still going on. Okay. And what I mean by that is that if I subscribe late, after the value has already been emitted onto the stream, it's still going to be there for me. Okay. Versus on a subject, I'd only get whatever the current, whatever new values from the point on that I subscribe on. So here we've got a private member variable called $, and we're setting that equal to a behavior subject, and I'm defaulting it to an empty user array. So, excuse me. I also now have a property getter called $, that returns an observable stream of user array, and I'm pointing it back to the behavior subject and calling the as observable. So this is not a requirement. You could actually expose the behavior subject directly. Kind of depends how much you trust your teammates or the people, the consumers of your code. Because no one would ever think about getting the behavior subject in their component and then nexting another value now onto the stream, right? And yeah, that never happens. Said no one ever. It's a really good idea to go ahead and do this. This prevents users or other developers from doing bad things with your code, with your behavior subject. And we can go ahead and just corner that off and make it so that that's not possible. So you can see here we're injecting the HTTP client via the constructor, and our load all does something a little different. It's not saying, hey, return this.http client. It's actually just making a call to HTTP client, if I can talk here. It's calling the get, calling API users, and we're doing a subscribe. And we're taking that, the value that it's returning, and we are nexting that onto the stream for our behavior subject. Now, before everybody jumps up and says, whoa, 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 you said don't subscribe. This is true, don't subscribe. Except for maybe in your behavior subject, your service of the subject service here. So what's nice here with the HTTP client is they know that this is an observable string that's going to terminate immediately. So it actually has an auto terminate in it. So once it goes out of scope, it'll go ahead and drop out, and you actually don't have to manage this. The problem is that typically when we're doing this, is we are emitting a new observable, and we're holding on to stuff, and that's what's creating our issue. So this is a nice way, a really clean way of doing it. The one way that you can do a subscribe and not have to worry about a potential memory leak here. All right, so great. Now we've talked about service with a subject. We've talked about container presenter. Yes, sir. Yeah, let's take that offline afterwards, because that's going down a little bit of a rabbit hole. But yeah, we'll talk about that. All right, so let's talk about NgRx now. So now we've actually got an application that has enough complexity. We've been implementing, let's say, service with a subject within our application, but now we have a page that's more complex, and we're dealing with more state management issues. We got some race conditions and things that NgRx would be really good for us to use for. Great. So we go ahead and decide to implement NgRx. And if you've ever seen Mike and Brandon's talk on NgRx, or any one of their talks, one of my favorites is when they're up on stage for, I think it was from NgConf last year, and Mike was coming up with all sorts of different things with actions are the mattress of the NgRx bed, or actions are the gluten of the NgRx loaf. So really the point here is that actions are the base. They are the fundamental base of NgRx. And this seems very Captain Obvious to me, but based off implementations that I've seen out there, it may not be Captain Obvious to everybody else. So your application is only going to be as good as your actions are. And so if you decide to start taking shortcuts and start doing some really one-off, weird kind of stuff using your actions, like here, I'll give you an example here. This has been changed, and we won't mention names to protect the guilty, but this is actual code from a client, and they had a single action that was used to update everything in the store. And they couldn't understand why they couldn't really take advantage of NgRx. They didn't have the traceability. They couldn't understand what was happening in their application. This is because they decided to take really massive shortcuts. It's great. Hey, we only have one action. That means I only have to handle one reducer. If you do this, you're going to have a price to pay later. This is really bad technical debt that's going to cause you a lot of problems. Don't take shortcuts. When you think about actions, you need to think about good action hygiene. You need to think about what's the best way to lay out my actions. I like to think about it, anything that we're interfacing on an API, we really have, for every one action that we want to perform, we really have 3 phases of it. We have the, hey, begin the request. So I want to load customer. Okay, let's begin loading customer. And then we have a load customer success, and we have a load customer fail. Okay? If you write those correctly, write your actions correctly, you'll be able to trace things back. Also with actions, and I don't have a slide for this, but one of the things you might want to consider, and this comes from Mike Ryan's talk on good action hygiene, is that if you have, let's say, 6 different places that all can be dispatching the same action, how do you know which one did it? So one of the things you might want to consider is adding a source property to your action, so you know who is kicking this off. So if you have a race condition, or you have this really odd condition that's occurring where you don't know why this is getting dispatched, add a source property to that and require that to be passed in so that you can have some traceability. But I'll also say don't implement that if you don't have that problem. Okay, go back to a very simple concept of KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Don't overcode it. Only add those pieces as you need them, and you don't necessarily need them everywhere. All right, selectors. So selectors are, if your store is like your client-side database, then your selectors are like your queries. And this is where your real power comes in. So they are a slice of state. They allow you to take whatever you have that's been placed into the store and allow you to take data back out of it and be able to do some manipulation. We can do mapping, sorting, filtering. Selectors are composable. So who knows what we mean by composable? You guys familiar with that? So if you're not familiar with composable, it means I don't have to write one big massive selector that does everything, like the Ginsu knife of selectors, if you will. I can actually write the separate small steps and pieces into separate selectors and then compose those together to create very powerful selectors. And the other thing that's really great about selectors is that they're memoized. So if the value in the store has not changed, I don't have to recalculate and run all the selectors again to get the value. It will go ahead and give me the last value since the store has changed. This is that point where I need another cough drop. The thing with selectors is this is not a license for you to then load the entire database into your store and then use selectors so that you don't have to use the API anymore. Although that would seem brilliant, that tends to crash your browser, and the client has a very horrible experience client side. So only load what you need. Only keep what you need. And so as you're moving from page to page, it should be dumping out data out of the store and then reloading data as it's needed. So here is an example of a selector. And so we have a function here called select total, passing it to state. It returns a memoized value of 8. One of the common things that happens here that people get hung up on is that even though values in the store have changed, that they're still getting the value of 8 when they select total. And this most commonly happens is when we are using get with latest from another store. So when we're getting total, we might be pulling from product and from order. And even though product hasn't changed where we have the select total at, or maybe vice versa here, but Product hasn't changed, but order has. And I'll actually need to manually call release on my selector to have it dump the memoization so that I can get the recalculated value. This is just something that you need to know. It's in the docs. It's kind of hidden. A lot of people don't know about this, and they get frustrated with selectors because they don't understand why it's still calculated in the same way. All right. Another common piece here that we see people doing is nested data. So anybody nest their data in NgRx? Come on, tell me the truth. Anybody? No one's, we got a hand raiser. All right. All right. How are those reducers looking? Yeah, they're complicated. Nested data is considered a very bad practice, but it's something that is done more often than we might like to admit. Often our APIs that are returning data down to us return it with nested data. Somebody on the back end thought it'd be a really good idea that you should return products orders and all this other stuff all in one big payload, and that's not such a good idea because mostly what we end up with is duplicated data, which then becomes difficult to work with. So what happens there is we end up creating complexity, and having done some demos on this, I didn't even realize how easy it is to start mutating the data in my store. My reducers went from 2 or 3 lines, or 1 or 2 lines of reducer code to make my changes in my store, to all of a sudden now they're 200 lines. So they're very complex. So you want to get away from any sort of nested data. Here's an example here where we've got a blog, and you see that the blog has an author attached to it, and then it's got its title, and it's got comments, and then the comments got another user attached to it, and then vice versa. I've got the same two users, one writing an article and one commenting, and vice versa. So the problem here is that if Bob, who wrote Article 1 and made a comment on Article 2, decides he wants to now go by Robert, you got to go fix this in 2 places. That's the really simple example. What if Bob's in there a couple thousand times? Okay, now you got to go hunt Bob down and try to find all this duplicated data and go clean that up yourself. So the recommendation is to go ahead and split that apart. So you'd actually want to have blogs, and you would want to have users, and then instead of having where we had the author before, that now we're just referencing an author ID. So this might be something that you're going to have to manage on your own. If you're not able to change the backend API, the recommendation is within your service, actually I'll talk about this in the next slide, you're going to need to split it apart somewhere and get that data so that there's separate stores. And then we'll talk about a library that's going to help you manage this and make this a lot easier for once you get them separated, but you're going to need to separate them. So you can split this nested data apart for the store. You can do this in your service. You could do this in your effect. You could do this in a helper function. But the point being is that you need to do it. And the price you're going to pay if you don't is you're going to have, like I said, really complicated reducers that are very difficult to maintain. And you better turn on the store freeze and pay attention to what's going on there, because it's so easy to mutate that data. Because again, you can't change one property that's buried way down in there and change his name to Bob, because it's going to mutate that entire object in the store, which then causes a whole set of problems. And then on top of that is if you're rendering lots of components, and especially in a large component hierarchy, it's going to force every single one of those to re-render. Okay? So there's definitely some complications there that we're going to want to consider. All right. Though going back the other direction is you might want to consider using selectors to reassemble your data back into a nested structure. So what I'm telling you is it's not a good idea to put nested data into the store, but you might want to do nested data to do the actual implementation and the rendering. Okay? Otherwise, you're going to have to deal with a complicated structure and pass down blogs, comments, and users down into a component hierarchy that becomes difficult for us to manage. Okay? So one of the recommendations here is create a selector that would actually take the data back out of the store and reassemble it back into a new view model that I can now pass to the view, and it works beautifully. I don't have to worry about recreating that. So let's talk about NgRx libraries. And the first one that I want to talk about, it's one of my favorite libraries, and it's not used as much. So who's using NgRx Entity right now? 1, 2, 2. Is that it? Nobody over here? Anybody? 3? So remember, over half the room raise their hands, right? I've used NgRx. So what's interesting here is, and this shows with the number of downloads as well. There's only about 322,000 downloads per month, but we have over 800,000 downloads a month of NgRx. So what does that tell me? That tells me that, hey, we have a certain number of users that are using NgRx. They're learning it. They might not be using it in production, but we have still a large group that are probably doing production applications that are using NgRx, but they're not using NgRx Entity. So NgRx Entity is really your saving grace for how do I manage entities and how do I work with relational data as well as like nested data. So NgRx Entity, the idea here is that it prefers dictionaries over arrays. And the idea is that if we leave the data in the store as arrays, when we're trying to marry it back together, I'm going to have to filter and find. Now, that's not a big deal if I'm finding 1 or 2, right? But when I got to marry up stuff on 1,000, that's a really expensive operation that isn't going to go so well on the client-side browser. So we need a way to be able to find data quickly by ID. So what we do here is instead of storing data as an array, it's going to get stored as a dictionary, which is a plain old object. The key is going to be whatever your unique identifier is, usually your ID, correct? And then the value is going to be your object. And that way, if I need a product with 345 as the ID, I can just say, get me the products, square brackets, 345. Boom, I have that. I don't have to go search for it. We can marry those up very, very quickly. So we get super fast finds. And the other nice thing here about NgRx Entity is it has built-in methods and selectors to help support this right myself. So imagine trying to take array-based data and convert it to a dictionary and then get it from a dictionary and convert it back to an array. Because you can't ng4 on dictionary data. That doesn't work. And so we have to have a way of getting it back. So here, I've got an example of, I've got blogs, and then it's going to create 2 properties, entities and IDs. IDs on the bottom there, that's the natural order of the IDs as it came in. Okay, so that way I can iterate over the IDs, find them by by that ID, and be able to reassemble this back to an array instantly, very, very quickly. And then you can see on the entities, I've taken the ID of 1, and that becomes my key for the first blog article, and so on and so forth for the second one. You can see I've got an author ID of 1, an author ID of 2. So this is going to make it really simple to reassemble this later and be able to work with this relational data in a non-relational way, if you will. So let's talk about another tool here that you might want to consider. Who's heard of NgRx data or is using NgRx data currently? Okay, so this is another really great way to use NgRx and not have to go diving off into the deep end of the pool. So NgRx data is simple configuration. It allows us to go in and define, these are my entities, and it will go ahead and through services configure this up so that I can have NgRx data manage that entity for me. It's actually built upon NgRx Entity. And so if you become familiar with NgRx Entity and how it stores data and how that sort of works, you're going to be able to jump right into this. It's going to be really, really simple. I like to kind of coin this as easy NgRx. You don't have to do a lot of work. It's pretty simple. There's ways that I can go ahead and extend it, make it simpler. You can eject out of it. You can say, hey, look, you know what? You were handling heroes for me all this time. It's been absolutely fantastic, but I'm going to handle heroes now manually because we have enough of disparity that I want to do this myself. I can go ahead and turn that off and then write out actions reducers, effects, and selectors for that and manage it 100% on my own or anywhere in between as well. And the nice thing here is for a lot of users, it's going to be very simple for them to work with because I'm just interacting with services. So what does that look like? Here I have a service. or actually I have a component that is calling the hero service. So if I want to add a hero to the store, it's as simple as saying this.hero service add and passing it in. And that's going to go ahead and manage this data, put that hero into the store for me. I don't have to do anything. I can do the same for a delete. I can call get heroes. That's going to go ahead and get all the heroes out of the database, and it's going to put those into the store and make those available to me. So really simple NgRx implementation. By the way, this was just merged in to NgRx 8.0, I believe. This was written by Ward Bell and John Papa. Another thing you should consider for tools when you're building applications and you're using NgRx is NgRx comes with schematics. So there's some schematics there that you could use to generate out some really base code for how you would do your NgRx implementation. We found that that wasn't quite as effective as what we were looking for, and we went ahead at Brebug and created our own entity schematic. So what does this buy you if you use our entity schematic? By the way, this is just free. It's out on NPM. It's a really quick way to do CRUD operations without having to spend much time. It'll go ahead and generate, here I generate it out for customer. I'm getting actions, effects, effects spec. I get a model, I get my reducer and a spec for that, and I get a service and an index, which is my selectors. So it gives me everything out of the box of what I need, all with just doing NGG, at Brebug schematic, and tell the name of the entity, and it gens all that out for me. Great. So there's also one other thing I want to tell you about that's currently in beta that you might be interested in checking out. It's called NgRx Auto Entity. So after I'd seen a talk by John Papa and Ward Bell a year ago at NgConf, I wasn't sure that that's really what I wanted. And so we went ahead and I came up with this crazy idea that we should be able to have a concept of generic actions, especially for CRUD operations. So a generic action would be, hey, I want to load by ID. Well, why couldn't I then just use generics and say, yeah, pass it using generics customer? And it would know how to go do that and put it into the store and do all this. And so we went ahead and wrote this library. We're using it currently in a couple different projects. It's currently in beta right now, but we are using it in production on several apps, and it's something you might want to look at least in a way to understand what another solution might be. So facades, NgRx facades. Who's using facades or is familiar with NgRx facades? All right, anybody know Thomas Burleson or read his article on facades? Okay, yeah. So Thomas, great guy, wrote a fantastic article on facades, and it's something that I think that we should all understand. So they're very similar to service with a subject. In fact, it's almost identical, but the implementation gets done a little differently. What it does, it allows us to remove the NgRx implementation from our components. The beauty here, and what we talked about, what I was saying, hey, start small, start simple, and then have a nice clear upgrade path into NgRx. Well, facades help you actually get there. So we can have a component that was originally written with behavior subjects, with service with a subject, and then be able to upgrade it to NgRx, and the component code doesn't need to change at all. The component code could stay exactly the same. Your choice. So what's nice with facades and how this is all possible is because it hides the NgRx implementation into the facade class. So let's take a look at what that might look like. Here I've got a regular old service called user service, and I don't have a private member variable that I had before. Now I just have my get property, and I have get users, $, looks exactly like it was before, but instead of returning the behavior subject as an observable, now I'm actually having it use the store. So here we're injecting the store into the service, and I'm saying this.store pipe, return that using the selector from users, get all users. Same exact code from the interface is what we were using before in the behavior subject, but now we're using NgRx instead of using a behavior subject. So if we look at the other side of that, the load all function before was actually making the HTTP call, getting the data, subscribing, and putting that data onto the stream. In this case, now with the NgRx facade, I'm going to just use the store to dispatch a new action called load all users, which would then get picked up by an effect, and that effect would go ahead and do the load. The reducer would then get the data on the success of that, and the selector would have our data for us. So nice, clean path. So we've covered a lot in the tools section. Here's the important part that I really want you to hear. Find a tool that works for you. There's a lot of people out there to tell you, don't use facades. Don't use certain behavior subjects. Don't use this, don't use that. Use what's going to work well for your team. Try to find a way that you're going to maximize your velocity. You're going to create a nice, clear, concise upgrade path. And you're going to get your jobs done. I think as long as, the one caveat I'm going to say is, use Container Presenter. Because that's one of those core pieces that you really need to understand that's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headaches later. And then you can kind of move around between behavior subject to, actually you can even go with, hey, I want to just do standard old components. I want to have my component just call a regular old service, and I'm going to go ahead and manage the observable stream in my component directly and pass it down to a child component. Very similar to what a lot of us are doing currently, all the way up to, hey, I've got a full NgRx implementation and nice and clean. So let's talk about a couple other things here really quick. Who likes testing? All right, maybe 20%. Excellent. Well, testing can be challenging. and testing NgRx can be tough. Who's heard of Jest? Jest.js. All right. Who's using Jest? Okay, a few less. All right. So Jest is one of those really cool frameworks, testing tools that I love. It's built upon Jasmine by the Facebook team. What I love about it, it's super, super fast. It runs failed tests first, and those two are great. There's a great watch window and a bunch of really nice features to Jest, but snapshot testing is where it's at. So without snapshot testing, I've got this test here, right, where I'm saying I'm going to test my reducer, and we're going to test the insert user action, and we're going to call user reducer, pass in some initial state, and with this new action, and before I'd say to equal or to be, and then I have to create this object literal that would represent the state, right? Which is cool. That's no big deal, right? Until it changes. And then it changes in like 80 spots as I'm trying to get my feature request done and get it pushed up, which is really, there's a way to fix this problem in a production app. You just start at the top of the file, and you just highlight everything, and you do command / and it just comments all that stuff out. And all those tests now pass miraculously, right? Who's never done this, right? Yeah, right. Nobody raises their hand. Everybody's done this at some point. Commented out test because I can't get my code out unless I do this. Imagine a world, if you will, where you could rerun the test and says, hey, we got some problems here. We got 80 snapshots that don't match. You could go in and visually compare them. It'll give you a diff comparison on each one. It has an interactive mode where you can go file by file and go, yep, we're all good here. Yep, we're good there. And I don't have to maintain any of these. They actually then get checked in with my PR, so my team gets to review and take a look at, hey, do these snapshot changes make sense for the simple request that we gave you to fulfill? And if they don't, they've got those to look at and understand kind of what's going on there. So snapshot testing save you a lot of time, will make your testing a lot easier. Jest.js is perfect for testing reducers, selectors, effects. Jasmine marbles for effects. Notice, by the way, I don't put actions in there. Don't test your actions. You don't really need to test your actions, because basically at that point you're just testing TypeScript. Does TypeScript work? I don't know. I think the TypeScript team has a couple of tests to make sure that TypeScript still works. But yeah, testing actions is a waste of time. But testing reducers and selectors and effects, that's big. So testing effects is a little bit more tricky. Who's successfully tested an effect? I got 2 hands. Any over here? I got a couple over here. All right, Brian, you don't count. Of course you've done that. So think about an effect really quick. So an effect is listening for an action to be dispatched, and when that happens, it's going to check to see if that action matches the kind of action that I care about. And then typically it's then going to call a service, which is now return a new observable stream, which I need to wait for to get done. And then I need to check to see if it calls a new action and dispatches that one. Right? All this asynchronous craziness that's going on, and trying to, like, how would you really write a test for that? You know, think about it. If you were just using Jasmine and Karma, how would you write a test to dig through and try to, like, that melts my mind. And it's like, I don't really know how I do that. So Jasmine Marbles. Jasmine Marbles is a great tool for making asynchronous operations synchronous and controllable and simple. So without going too deep on this here, you can see I've got, first I have my entity. That's just some generated data. It's calling a function to go generate out an entity. And then I've got my insert action and a success action. So my insert action equals a new insert user action, and I'm passing it that entity. And my success action, this is what I'm hoping to get at the end, is that I get an insert user success, and that it has that entity as the result. And then I've got, what gets a little bit more tricky is the next 3 lines here. I've got a response, an expected, and an actions. So the response is, what do I expect to come back from the service? The expected is actually using my success action. This is what I want to end with. So that's at the end of the test. This is what I'm hoping to get. And then on my actions, I'm setting that equal to be a hot observable, and that's going to be my insert action. That's what my effect is listening for. And then we've got our service create. We're pointing that to be, it's basically just reassigning this function using the adjust stub to be the response. The response again. So this is our service call called create is going to return a response that has our entity in it. Okay. So there's some great documentation on NgRx marbles, or I'm sorry, NgRx marbles, Jasmine marbles on how to use this. Also, I did a talk on this at NgConf in 2018. That's another great resource for this. We could spend 20 or 30 minutes just digging through how to do these and how Jest helps you. But if you can trust me, this will make it possible for you to be able to test your effects and make things really simple. All right, so on the front end side, and this is really not related to NgRx, but I just tossed a slide in anyway, one of my favorite tools, and if you don't know about it, I actually learned about it here at the Angular New York meetup just a little over a year ago. Gleb came and talked about it. I am now a Cypress ambassador. I do a lot of talks on Cypress. It makes end-to-end simple and easy. The beautiful thing here is that we can stub out requests. And so the moment it starts that it leaves our application and enters into Google to start actually making our HTTP request, we can intercept it and say, hey, here's the data that you want. It allows us to be able to test edge cases very, very quickly. We don't have to wait for the server, so that the requests actually fire off much faster, and they're super reliable. In fact, I'll tell you that they're 100% reliable. When the tests pass, they pass. And when they fail, it's because there's a real reason. Like, who's had Selenium where you have the test failure of the day, right? That always works locally really, really well. Nothing blows up locally, but it always fails, the random test up on the CI server. All right. So if you haven't checked out Cypress, take a moment to look at that. Also, another cool thing you can do with it is visual testing. Who saw Gleb's post this morning about the meetup today? Anybody? Nobody? All right. Crickets? Cool. We'll just move on. All right, let's talk about some advanced stuff in terms of actions and effects. So these next 2 slides are really getting you to understand that there's a couple different types of actions and what those types are and how we're actually already using them today. But to get a little bit of documentation around this. So action types, there's 3 basic types. There's a command, like, hey, go do this. There's a document which says, hey, update the store. And then we have some sort of event that's occurred, usually like an error. And so if we take a look at an existing effect, I have a command which is insert user. The resulting after it calls the service, and I get a result back, and I say, hey, I want to go ahead and insert this into my store. That's of type document. And then I've got an event type, which is when I've caught an error, and we want to now document some user event that has occurred. So those are the three different types of actions. That becomes a little bit more useful when we start to break down actions, and we're talking with our team members about what are we trying to achieve? What is the flow here? And so having some names around those, I think, helps the conversation. So let's talk about effect types. So there's 5 different ones here. We're really going to talk about the first 3. I'll briefly touch on the last 2. These are actually written by one of the sponsors of Angular New York. Narwhal, Victor Safkin wrote a great article on this. I'm just trying to expand this a little bit more and maybe hopefully make it even more palatable and understandable so you'll understand how you could use it in your project. So the first one here is store-based deciders. So often what happens is that we're going to have an action that gets dispatched, and we need to make a decision in the effect on how we want to proceed. Okay, so we might have something as simple as, hey, I want to do a customer save. Well, is it an insert or is it an update? We might want to keep it, for some reason within the application that we want to keep it as a very simple, generic, top-level action called save, and that will allow the effect to decide how that's going to get processed. So that might be as just simple as looking at the payload and saying, hey, if the payload.customer.id is greater than 0, then do an update, otherwise do an insert. But we can also do stuff where we can use with latest from, and I can get from the store, using a selector, I could go get the selected user ID. I could go get data out of the current store for my entity, or I could get it from another store or multiple stores and be able to combine that in to be able to make some sort of decision. So from here, I can then map my action with my value from with latest from, and I can dispatch a new effect from there. So those are deciders. Those allow us to do more complicated actions from within our effects, and not have to deal with that logic within a component. Again, we want to remove this logic from our components and move it into a space that's more reusable and going to be more consistent for how we're applying it. So let's talk about splitters. To me, this is one that's super cool. A lot of times I see this on a big page where if I need to do a load of the page and I don't want to have my container component spit out 15, dispatch statements to dispatch out all the different loads, I could actually just create a separate action called load dashboard page, and then the load dashboard page will flat map out and return an array of new actions to dispatch. I can split that up and have it go load all the 15 other entities that need to get loaded for this page, and I can do that with a single. Again, allows me to encapsulate what's going on within our component. My component doesn't have to know about all the different data that needs to get loaded. It might even be data that this page doesn't necessarily directly get impacted by, but that data is needed for the page to work correctly. So splitters give us a great way to do this. This example here is just adding a log operation. So hey, we want to go load by ID, but since this is loading an admin user, we want to log this so we can see who is requesting this. Something like that. That allows us to go ahead and do a splitter. Awesome. Aggregator, I think, though, this is the one that blows my mind a little bit more, is now we've split stuff up, but what if I want to bring the streams back together, right? Unlike in Ghostbusters where they say never cross the streams, what if we want to have the streams cross and we bring everything back together? I need to wait to process the next piece once these 3 or 4 operations have all completed. If they complete, how would you wait for that currently? So in this case here, I've got my action, which is load user by ID, and I'm doing a flat map and then a zip. And my zip is what's going to say, hey, once all these occur, we're going to go on to our next step. And so I'm watching for the load user by ID success, and I'm watching for my logged to be complete. So this would be my aggregator for my previous effect that allow me to wait for those 2 things to complete before I would go on and I would dispatch a new load admin user success. But what I hope you can see here is this could allow you to be able to split stuff off into multiple operations and then be able to wait for them to come back. And be able to do some really powerful stuff based off of that. The one question I get often with this is, well, what happens if they don't come back? Nothing. Okay, nothing will happen. Nothing will get dispatched. It'll basically just die out. Okay. Also, when thinking about aggregators, in our case here, we used the zip operator, but depending on how you want it to interact, you might want to consider using fork join, combined latest, or with latest from. There's a great article that I have listed here. By the way, I'll actually, on my Twitter account, I'll post the slides. I'll also get those to the Tanya and the organizers, so you guys can have those. But bit.ly ag-ops, and so those are for aggregator operators. Depending on how you want that data to be handled, you can apply different operators to that aggregator and get different results there. Great. So last thing I want to leave you with is a product called LogRocket. Anybody heard of LogRocket? Few. Okay. Anybody using LogRocket? A few. Okay, cool. So LogRocket's great for being able to log errors. And I know there's a ton of error loggers out there. There's a ton of different tools that you can use. What I like about LogRocket is it's really good for doing NgRx. So it is actually capturing state for us. And so I can literally see what the state is in the application as each action's being dispatched. Okay, the really bad part of this is now I can no longer say that it only works, well, it works on my machine. I don't see how that they're possibly getting this error. We can actually really see what's happening, see what that data is, and gives us an opportunity then to write a test, let's say using a tool like, I don't know, Cypress, to be able to recreate what they were doing and see that failure and then be able to deal with it appropriately. So it records sessions. It's great with NgRx, like I said, with a nice little meta reducer. It's very simple to implement, whatnot. If you just go out to logrocket.com, it's a great tool. Again, with all the stuff that we've been talking about tonight, I'm not part of the NgRx team, though I'm kind of an ambassador lately for NgRx. I don't work for Cypress, and I don't work for LogRocket. These are all just tools that I see out there that people are using successfully, and they're able to create a lot of value with them. So again, find tools that work for you, find tools that work for your teams, increase your velocity, rethink whether or not you actually need NgRx. It might be able to do a lot of what you need to do just using with behavior subject, with facade like pattern, and have a really nice clear upgrade path. So with that, thanks everybody for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. If you got questions, I think Brian had a great suggestion. We're going to do those at the bar. It's per drink? No? Yeah? Per drink. Okay, question per drink. No. I think we're going to do a little panel after this, and so if you have some questions, I'd be happy to answer those for you. You can reach me at jessys_Breebug. That's my Twitter handle, and that's my real email address as well, jessysanders@breebug.com. I do my best to respond to questions within 24 to 48 hours, if not a lot sooner. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.